This is a revision video for Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare. It is set as part of the AQA L2 examination, so we're talking about speech and how it's used. You'll see how I'm doing it in a couple of slides' time. I'm just going to go over the background information for the play and the title first. The play was written in the early 1600s. I'm not sure if anyone knows when exactly it was written. I mean, some people don't think it was written by Shakespeare at all, but that's roughly when it was written, so you're sort of thinking the time period. The play itself is set in Vienna, though it's believed that Shakespeare based it on London, so he used Vienna as a means of being able to show London without looking like he was directly pointing a finger of blame at London. It's a black comedy, so you'll find some hilarious jokes in there about beheading, sex, power, that sort of thing. And it centres on the idea of justice and mercy, as seen in its title. The title, Measure for Measure, is a biblical reference, which is to do with the idea of being treated as you treat others. I mean, there's a biblical quote here saying, with the measure you use it will be measured to you. So basically means, if you punish someone a certain way, then that's how you'll be punished if you do the same equal. And it's to do with the idea of balance and imbalance in a dysfunctional society. The play opens with the Duke having a lengthy monologue in public. It's quite important to note that it's in public because this is public speech, rather than some speech we might see later in private. It's lengthy, which shows no one wants to interrupt him because he has the power. He's conversational power because he's in authority. He gains the respect of the audience. It's written in iambic pentameter. Later on in the play we'll meet characters who speak in prose. Because it's written in iambic pentameter, this shows that he has quite a high class, he's of quite a high status, so that's how they tend to speak. Iambic pentameter means it is 10 syllables per line. They tend to be quite poetic, and in terms of the emphasis within the words themselves, it goes from being emphasised to emphasised to non-emphasised, alternately with words. You don't really need to know that. Within the speech, the Duke doesn't mitigate, he just gives orders. Bid come before us, Angelo. He's ordering people what to do because he has the power to do so. He has instrumental power. When he says something, it's done. He uses parallelism and contrast for effect. Lent him our terror, dressed him our love. Mortality and mercy. We've got our alliteration there. The idea of contrast could be to do with the different sides of society in Vienna. So we've got the rich people and the poorer people. It could be to do with the ideal and what actually occurs, that sort of thing. It's really important to note here when I say the Duke uses parallelism or contrast or effect, I mean Shakespeare. I mean, it's too long to type out Shakespeare each time. But for example, if you were giving the first point on this page, you might say, Shakespeare gives the Duke a lengthy monologue in public to show that the Duke has power and no one dares to interrupt him, ... Because it's really important to show that you know that these are just characters rather than real life people having a real life conversation. So if you haven't got Shakespeare in at least once in every paragraph, then you probably need to slip him in somewhere just to make sure the examiner knows exactly what you're thinking. The Duke draws upon religious parallels within his speech. Heaven doth with us as we with torches do. This shows that he has religious beliefs, so we therefore trust him more. We think he's got more morality, because, I mean, it'd be a typically religious audience, as was customary at the time, so they would believe in someone who used religious stuff. So this gives us the idea of faith within the Duke from the start. We've got more faith in our protagonist. The Duke telling Angelo to be himself isn't so much a speech feature, but it's just something really important. I thought this quote was quite important, so when you're writing an essay you might want to say, the Duke believes that Angelo isn't himself, live in thy tongue and heart is what the Duke said to Angelo, because he believed that Angelo had a different public and private self. So if you were writing an essay on Angelo and the differences between his public and private lives, or selves, then that might be a quote you might want to include with somebody else saying that about Angelo. Angelo actually appears to be quite reluctant and ambiguous, and there's an example there. And this could be because he doesn't believe that he should be let in power. Maybe he knows he's got these thoughts in his head, these lust, and he just doesn't want to be in a position where he could take advantage of them. But as he doesn't want to admit these thoughts, he's being relatively ambiguous about it, saying, mix more test of my metal, rather than coming out with it in public, so that'd just be bare embarrassing. Power imbalance between Angelo and the Duke is evident throughout the conversation, because Angelo refers to the Duke as his lord, states that he's always obedient, and if you look at the conversation, the Duke tends to have longer utterances. He speaks for longer because he has more power, and Angelo has to be respectful towards him because of that. Act 1, Scene 2 is set in Madame Overdon's pub, or bar, or brothel, or whatever it was, and it's not in contrived verse, it's in prose, which shows the massive change in social status from our lords to our gentry folk. I mean, they're still above the poverty line, but they're not quite dukes and lords and stuff like that. So if in your essay you were comparing two characters and one of them was a lord and one of them was Lucio or something, you might want to say, oh look, the lord speaks in contrived verse, in iambic pentameter, whereas Lucio just speaks in prose, although Lucio's speech does vary throughout the play depending on who he's with. Shakespeare uses the casual conversations between characters to tell us more about them in a subtle manner, so he says, "There's not a soldier of us," which tells us that the characters were soldiers at one point. And you'll see more stuff like this thrown in as the conversations progress between different characters. So, for example, we hear from other characters that Isabella is a nun rather than having her walking on stage wearing all the nun stuff straight away. This makes the audience feel more familiar with the characters before they've even met them. Going back to comparisons, if we're comparing Lucio in different scenes, one scene we might compare him with is when he's with his friends, and another when he's with someone else, like someone he respects. With his friends, he's quite provocative and argumentative. "Thou thyself art a wicked villain." It's basically banter of the day. Top quality, hilarious. Whereas when he's with people he respects more, he might... to be fair, when he's with different people, he's not particularly respectful with anyone. But if we go to right at the end of the play, when he's, begging for his life, begging not to marry this whore, he basically changes his lexis and his choice of words quite significantly. And then throughout the conversation there's references to sexual diseases of the time, in particular piles, hence the three-piled piece, and also syphilis, which was referred to as the French disease. So we've got the French velvet, French crown, because people went bald when they had syphilis, and thy bones are hollow, because maybe people's bones went hollow when they got syphilis. Obviously, English people refer to it as the French disease. French people obviously wouldn't be like, oh yeah, we've got syphilis. So they'd call it the English disease, and that was sort of the way things went at the time. This is just a basic example of the black comedy throughout the play. The people of the time lived quite a frigid life, so throughout the play there are a lot of sexual references, because this is the place people went to get their sex dose or whatever, apparently. People in the play are very open about their use of prostitutes, their sex. So Lucio, well, some people aren't. Claudio's not very open, but Lucio is. He's like, "I have purchased many diseases under her roof." From this, the audience gets the idea that Lucio is quite a funny person, but he's not necessarily a character they should respect, because obviously he's misusing prostitutes. This is something that was totally disagreed with at the time by law, although everyone did it. But it's quite a witty comment, isn't it? I found it quite funny. Which basically sums up my terrible Shakespearean sense of humour. If you are talking about Lucio, a word you can use is libertine, which means that he's beyond moral boundaries. So he's interested in sex, and he basically sums up the corruption in Vienna. Overdone is then used as a plot device to move the plot on. Because, as funny as it is hearing Lucio and his mates having banter about sexual diseases and stuff like that, there is a story to be told, and Shakespeare wants lessons to be learnt. So he uses Overdone to tell the story of what's happened quite quickly. So he's saying, someone's been arrested and been taken to prison, his head's going to be chopped off, and that's because he's got someone with child who's made someone pregnant. So this basically tells us Claudio's backstory, so the audience is in the know, they know what's going on, and this would have been quite a controversy at the time. Oh my god, shock horror. Overdone then uses anaphora for effect in an aside to the audience. This is a repetition of certain words at the set of beginning of clauses. So it emphasises everything she's saying, makes it seem more powerful, more important, throws it out at the audience, makes the audience think a bit, I suppose. She's like, what with the war? What with the sweat? What with the gallows? And in a sense, this makes the audience feel like everything's piling on top of these characters. Everything's going wrong right now. Overdone's brothel is about to be closed down. Might not be such a bad thing, because obviously she's spreading loads of diseases, but it just makes the audience feel slightly sympathetic towards her. It makes them realise that these are real people, in inverted commas, because they are obviously not real. Pompey is a character used for comic relief. His name is Pompey, but it just about says it all. He's rather crude humour. But I did find this bit absolutely hilarious that I've put there. "Yonder man is carried to prison. Well, what's he done? A woman!" I laughed. I'm probably the only one of the present day, but of course the Shakespearean audience, they would have been in fits. They would have been absolutely crying with laughter at that, because it's just brilliant. And that is the purpose of the play, other than to educate and to point out the mistakes. This play is a comedy. It's meant to entertain its audience. The use of different speech forms shows the different classes. I mean, we've said this a lot of times, but we've got Claudio, who speaks in a poetic manner. He's the tragic hero. And then we've got Lucio, the libertine, the rake. He speaks in prose. He's not of the same class, not of the same level. Claudio speaking in poetic manner with Lucio in prose makes Claudio's poeticness even more significant. It makes it shine out, so we feel immediately sorry for Claudio. We believe him to be an intelligent man who's just made a tragic mistake that he's got his girlfriend pregnant. Claudio uses repetition and a simile to describe the situation he's in. This means that he can avoid saying the true matter of the situation, because he doesn't want to go around like, oh, I had sex and I got my girlfriend pregnant. So he describes it as liberty, and he describes the situation as like rats raving down their proper bane. This basically makes him seem more of a man, because he's not just bragging about the sex he's had, or I suppose he's about to be executed, so he probably wouldn't be bragging. And it's just nice words as well, like liberty. The repetition of liberty makes them sound freedom. So this makes us think freedom. Maybe they had too much freedom back then, and now they're going to have their freedom chopped. It makes us have an idea of what Angelo's doing down there. By Claudio using a rather possessive word, my Lucio, it tells us immediately that there is a relationship between these characters. They've known each other before, so we can infer a lot from very small words about the relationships between various characters in the play. Claudio uses rather blunt language when he's talking about sex. He doesn't want to talk about it publicly. It's something he may be ashamed of. So he's like, no, and then someone asks him, lechery, and he's like, call it so. He doesn't want to say, I had sex. He's just embarrassed about it. We've talked about it already. Claudio sort of defends his actions by telling his story in a monologue, so the audience feels even sorrier for him. The audience is sympathetic towards his situation. He basically saying, I was going to marry my wife. She's basically my wife. We just needed to get a dowry, which is a payment that the wife makes towards the husband, then they would be together, married. So he was saying, we weren't just having sex for the fun of it. We did believe ourselves to be in a true relationship. We wanted to consummate it. We wanted to feel the affection, except, unfortunately, there was no sexual protection back then, or whatever it's called. I forgot what it's called now. Condoms. There were none of them back then, so he got her pregnant, sadly. Claudio then uses a euphemism to describe sex. He keeps it soft. This to make the audience feel, although it wouldn't be funny, but the audience would feel for him. They would respect him because he says mutual entertainment rather than shagging. Claudio is also used as a literary tool to describe Angelo's actions. Obviously, we can't have Angelo's every action being shown throughout the play because it would make the play far too long. I mean, it's long enough already. It's just so boring and dull. But that's just my opinion. You might love the play. But Claudio is basically used as a literary tool. So he says, Angelo's been commanding stuff. He's awakening all the enrolled penalties. So basically bringing back all these old laws everyone had thought had gone away. Claudio describes his sister to us before we've met her. So this gives us an idea in our heads already of what she's like. I mean, we know she's a nun from the word cloister, and also she's apparently moves men. I mean, we're not quite sure what this means. It probably means she's well spoken, but I mean, this is a major quote. The power to move men, just keep it. Make sure you have it written down. You might use it in any essay. But move men, at this point, we're not 100% sure of what it means, but we think she's probably quite powerful. It hints at the idea maybe there's going to be a relationship between her and another character if she can move men. And then Claudio then shows a bit of lack of morality in his request. He says, make sure that she makes friends with the deputy. Does he know that make friends means sex? We don't know. Act 1, Scene 3 begins in media res. This means that the conversation had started before the audience got to look in on it. So, he said, no, Holy Father, throw away that thought, is what the Duke says, which means that the friar must have said something to the Duke to make the Duke have this reaction. So we don't know quite what's gone on in the scene, though I suppose we can sort of guess that the Holy Father believes that the Duke succumbed to lust or something like that. The Duke then uses rather poetic yet ambiguous imagery, the dribbling dart of love. I mean, we've got our alliteration there, and it's quite lengthy lexis in a sense. So you might want to compare this to when he's the Friar Duke. I mean, that would be the main comparison for the Duke when he's in power and as the Duke, and when he's in power as the Friar Duke. People are respectful to the Duke when he's in different costumes for different reasons. At the moment, the Friar is respectful of the Duke. I mean, there's power asymmetry in this conversation because the Duke has such authority. I mean, he is the one that rules this whole land. I mean, the Duke is slightly respectful of the Friar because the Friar's obviously got religious power, but the Friar is more respectful towards the Duke. He calls him my lord and your grace. And then at the end of the scene, the Duke uses a monologue to share his ideas on justice. I mean, this idea here of saying we may as well have, the sticks in the corner. I mean, saying, you know, if a child misbehaves or hit him with a stick, but what use is it in reality? That's what we've got in Vienna at the moment, with all these punishments, but we're never actually going to punish people, it doesn't work. So it could be deemed from this that the Duke wants there to be punishments imposed, but he doesn't want to be seen to be the one behind it, because he's the people's person. And then here we've just got a nice metaphor of liberty, plucking justice by the nose. I think plucking people by the nose is repeated quite a lot in this play. Maybe it's a Shakespearean thing, but I don't really get it. But, I mean, the words liberty, freedom and justice, they're basically the themes of the play, and we're mentioning them quite early on so the audience knows what's happening. We know what the general plot's going to be, something to do with justice being imposed, freedom and the lack of, the impact it has on people, that sort of thing. The Duke actually uses quite a long list to describe Angelo to the audience. He calls Angelo precise, as he guard with terror. You know, his blood doesn't flow, he's got ice froth blood, and his appetite is more to bread than stone. So he's basically saying that Angelo is a good man of good morals. Apparently, that's what everyone believes. He's not stating his opinion on this matter, he's simply making a statement. And then he leaves the question to the audience. He says, shall we see if power change purpose? Shall we see what happens to Angelo when he gets power? It's basically very ambiguous throughout this conversation. Well, I suppose it's a monologue now. With his views, he isn't sharing them because he's quite a guarded person. I mean, later on we see that he doesn't take much credit at all for what he does. He tries to share it between people. I mean, here, even in this little bit here, it says, shall we see? It's not I, it's we. He tries to blame everybody else, make sure everybody else is taking part of the blame rather than stepping up himself and saying, I want to see whether he changes. I mean, it's a very slight observation, but it's these things that people want to pick up on when you're writing an essay. Act 1, Scene 4 also begins in media res. This is quite a common Shakespearean idea, he uses it in quite a lot of his plays. And it begins with Isabella going, and have you nuns no farther privileges? And this could be deemed to be a parallel to Angelo, who wishes for a more strict restraint. Rather than making them more lax, he wants everyone to be more stricter, because he believes in strictness and keeping of rules, very severe justice. Initially, Lucio is rather jovial with Isabella. He's like, hail, virgin, if you be. Quite similar in tone to when he was with Overton, but as he keeps going, he gradually converges his speech patterns more to Isabella's because he wants something from her. And as we look, I mean, if we open the play now and look at it, we can see who has the more power in the conversation. It's Lucio, probably because he's male, and at the time there was such sexual domination by males. I don't think it's sexual domination. I did not mean that gender imbalance, that's what I meant. Whoopsies. Yeah, gender imbalance, so the male would have the more power in the conversation naturally. Although, in some cases, Isabella's got such a strong way with words that she has more power in the conversation. Woo, we've reached the end of Act 1. I was originally going to have one video with all the acts in, but I got to the end of Act 2 and it was already 40 minutes long. I was like, I'm not going to have a 2-hour long video on Measure for Measure. I'm going to split it up into acts. So this is the end of Act 1 and hopefully I'll see you soon for Act 2. Hope it's helped. Have a lovely day. Bye.